Hello, friends. Author and fellow Deadhead Steve Silberman passed away suddenly just after the first episode of the good old Grateful Deadcast Season 10 was released. A frequent contributor to the Deadcast, Steve's insight and humor will be greatly missed. Here's Jesse.
There are layers of Deadheads. Original Haight-Ashbury or East Village Dead freaks. People who got into the band from hearing them on the radio in the American Beauty era, or when they were hitting college campuses hard in the early 70s. Fans who came on board after the massive summer festivals at Watkins Glen or Englishtown, or the touchheads who arrived with In the Dark in the 80s. I was none of those. I was, and am, a skeleton key head. Steve Silberman is one of my favorite writers ever, and in that way, I still want everybody to meet and hang out with him. As far as I'm concerned, Skeleton Key should be issued to all newly minted Dead freaks, anybody who has anything to do with the Dead, or anyone who's ever heard the phrase Grateful Dead and is remotely curious. His other book, Neurotribes, meanwhile, should probably just be issued to all humans. Find the Others remains perhaps Timothy Leary's most sage piece of advice. Steve was an excellent and righteous other finder, equally well-indexed and ready to be found. As we've been saying, fly your freak flags at half-mast. Love you, Steve.
The Good Old Grateful Deadcast, the official podcast of the Grateful Dead. I'm Rich Mahan with Jesse Jarnow, exploring the music and legacy of the Grateful Dead for the committed and the curious. Ladies and gentlemen, fellow Deadheads, welcome to Season 10 of the Good Old Grateful Deadcast. I'm your co-host, Rich Mahan. Thank you very much for tuning in. In this episode of the Good Old Grateful Deadcast, we continue our journey through the new Grateful Dead box set, Friend of the Devils. This time around, we delve into the two Atlanta shows in the box from the Fox Theater on April 10th and 11th, 1978. This new limited edition Friend of the Devils box set is selling quick and with good reason. The band was playing great in spring 78, and as the name suggests, this 19 CD box set presents 8 unreleased concerts that feature the rise of drums and space as second set traditions. Friend of the Devils April 1978 includes complete shows from Curtis Hickson Convention Hall, Tampa, Florida, 4/6/78, Sportatorium in Pembroke Pines, Florida, 4/7/78, the Veterans Memorial Coliseum in Jacksonville, Florida on 4/8/78, the Fox Theater Atlanta, Georgia, which we're talking about today, on 4/10 and 4/11/78, Cameron Indoor Stadium at Duke University in Durham, North Carolina, 4/12/78, the Castle Coliseum in Virginia, at the Polytechnic Institute in Blacksburg on 4/14/78, and the Huntington Civic Center in Huntington, West Virginia on 4/16/78. The concert at Duke is the breakout show from this box and will be released separately as Duke 78. It'll be available as a 3 CD set, a 4 LP set, and of course digitally. Both Duke 78 and the limited edition Friend of the Devils will be released on September 20th. More info and orders are happening now over at dead.net. Head on over to dead.net/deadcast. Check out all of our past episodes, including the complete seasons 1 through 9. You can link from there to your favorite podcasting platform so you can listen how, when, and where you like to listen. Please help this podcast by subscribing, sharing us with your friends on social media, hitting that like button, and leaving a review. Thank you very much. Hey, were any of you heads out there at any of the shows in spring 78 up and down the East Coast? Well, we want to hear from you. We need your stories to illustrate just how wonderful all of these shows were. Record your tour story at stories.dead.net, and you may hear yourself on a future episode of the Deadcast. We've got a way that you can dive into these Deadcasts a little more closely. We have transcripts from many of your favorite Deadcast episodes available for your reading pleasure. Head on over to dead.net/deadcast-index and check them out. Oh, Atlanta. Anybody who's been to the Fox Theater knows what a special place it is. And on April 10th and 11th, 1978, the Grateful Dead treated the citizens of Hotlanta to 2 memorable shows. We're going to hear about the Dead's history in this southern metropolis, meet some very interesting people who hung with the band and Jerry, and dive into the changes to Garcia's gear setup that allowed him to generate the new sounds of this era. It's time to hand the microphone over to your friend and mine, Jesse Jarnow.
After opening their Spring 78 tour with 3 shows in Florida, the Grateful Dead rolled into Atlanta for 2 nights at the Fox Theater, now the 4th and 5th shows on the new Friend of the Devil's box. Grateful Dead archivist and legacy manager David Lemieux.
I loved both these shows. These were shows I got early in my tape trading when the Betty board started showing up from this tour. The Fox shows were the first 2 I got. It's a long tour. It's the 6th through the 24th, and then a 10-day break before another 2 weeks. So they're busy. They got a lot going on. They're recording a new album, Shakedown Street on the go. But these shows at the Fox really shows that the tour is really building momentum. And that's what I find this tour builds more than any other tour. I find that a lot of tours start strong, if not a little mellow, and strong, and they've got like a vibe. This one keeps growing keeps going up as the shows go on. Upside down, inside down, false alarm, the only game in town. No man plan, the only game in town. Parable, the only game in town. It was later in 1978 that Bill Graham had one of his famous lines about the Dead painted on the outside of Winterland.
They're not the best at what they do. They're the only ones who do what they do. The Grateful Dead, please.
We're going to use Betty Cantor Jackson's beautifully recorded tapes from the 2 Fox gigs, listen to some never-heard interviews with Jerry Garcia, and talk about some other popular and underground music of the era to really get inside what Bill Graham's famous phrase meant in April 1978. Once in a while you can get shown the light in the strangest of places if you look at it right. At the most surface level, the Grateful Dead changed their set lists around. Of their rock and roll peers in 1978, like the Rolling Stones, Neil Young, and Bob Dylan, the Dead were among the few to be predictably unpredictable. Even Bruce Springsteen and Frank Zappa were playing basically the same set lists night after night in 1978, with only a few changes. Hot Tuna had been keeping things pretty loose, but they broke up at the end of 1977. If you wanted to follow an artist with truly variable set lists, and weren't a jazz fan, you had to look a little deeper to the rock underground, to artists like NRBQ or the Patti Smith Group, who'd started playing some of the same theaters the Dead and their side projects could still cram into. But set lists were only one level of what was variable about the Dead's music.
To see this in the Fox Theater, again, I always encourage people to look at the venue before they listen to a show, because this is a great looking venue. The Dead had a bit of a history there, 77, 78, 85, played some good shows there. Don't murder me. I beg you, don't murder me. Please don't murder me. And I've got to wonder, did that inspire the band to play differently when they get into a nice, beautiful theater versus playing a dumpy arena? Does that translate to the vibe of the show? I don't know. Certainly, they're 2 very different venues, and this is, 5 days apart. So you've played 3 kind of weird venues in Florida, and now you're in these beautiful theaters in Atlanta, where they clearly love playing.
It certainly made a difference to the vocalists in the band. Please welcome back Donna Jean Godchaux-MacKay.
Oh, like singing in a theater? Oh, my gosh. Oh, a theater like that was built for music instead of a hockey rink or something else. Just to sing in a theater was just like, oh, my gosh, this is what this building was made for, was music. So I love that. I love that. And coming from a studio mentality, it was more controlled. And so you had, more of a controlled sonic atmosphere in a theater than elsewhere.
Slowly round the fire. When he is done, I wanna know him better.
When the Grateful Dead returned to the road in 1976, part of the intent was to keep things at a more manageable level for both the band and audience, with the hopes that they could spend more time playing in the theaters that the band considered their natural home. But by 1978, that was getting to be a losing battle, because of the demand for the band, because sometimes the band needed the paydays, and because sometimes there just wasn't a nice theater to play. In Atlanta, circumstances combined to put them in a beautiful venue during their late 70s appearances. The Dead's first two shows in Atlanta, in 1969 and 1970, were both with Atlanta's hometown underground heroes who, like the Dead had done in San Francisco, pioneered the local practice of playing for free in the park and became one of the most legendary and incredible groups in the city's history. I'm speaking, of course, of the Hampton Grease Band. We're absolutely delighted to welcome, from the Hampton Grease Band, guitarist Glenn Phillips.
When the Grease Band first started, we couldn't find any place to play. And I had read about the Grateful Dead doing shows in the park. And so I went down to Piedmont Park in Atlanta, which is a really big park, with a clock radio, because I had seen that there was an outlet in the pavilion. And I plugged it into the pavilion, and I realized it was live. And I just said to the band, we need to start going down to the park and playing.
Well, hey, old lady, what do you do? I pick up garbage and what's it to you? Spend my lifetime walking around, picking up residue all over town. When I'm seen, everyone roars. I keep the streets clean, that's what I'm for.
The Hampton Grease Band was fronted by young Bruce Hampton, not yet militarized. He would only promote himself to colonel in the 80s and wasn't the leader of the Grease Band, despite being its namesake.
We started going down there every week. And by the following summer, later that summer, other bands were joining us. And then then we got a call from the Allman Brothers, from Phil Walden. Can the Allman Brothers come play with you? Then we played there with the Grateful Dead, and it just exploded into this whole scene. And it was like this influence of reading a line about them playing in the park for free that led to this scene exploding in Atlanta from me plugging a clock radio in, even to the point where the Grateful Dead were playing there.
St. Stephen with the rose, sitting out of the garden he goes. Country garden in the wind and the rain, wherever he goes, the people all complain.
The Dead show in Piedmont Park in July 1969 was their first appearance in Atlanta, including a super jam that was also their first time playing with the members of the Allman Brothers. Sadly, neither Glenn Phillips nor Harold Kelling from the Grease Band played in the super jam. In the late 60s and early 70s, the Hampton Grease Band anchored a thriving local scene, in part because Glenn saw the band at the Fox in '78 too, in part because I'm an enormous fan of both the Grease Band and Glenn's solo work. We're going to use them as a way to tell the story of how the Grateful Dead's music evolved and what it meant in 1978. Not that other towns had bands exactly like the Hampton Grease Band, but lots of towns had their own underground rock acts that started in the 60s, who didn't quite break through nationally, but whose members stayed active as members of the longer musical continuum, blurring the lines between eras and subcultures. The Dead and the Grease Band only crossed paths a few times, but it made an impact.
I remember talking to Jerry Garcia at one point about comic books, and that he was very into comic books, and I was very into comic books when I was growing up. Just the expression, an open-ended expression of imagination is what it's about, and that's the button that it pressed in him and in myself and in many others. And just finding that wherever you did, whether it was a novel, a comic book, a movie, another band, just seeing, sort of being taken aback by the openness and the freedom of it. It allows you to feel like you have a license to do the same thing.
Before we get too much further, I'll note that we've posted links at dead.net/deadcast to Glenn's music, as well as his excellent and soulful memoir, Echoes, The Hampton Grease Band, My Life, My Music, and How I Stopped Having Panic Attacks.
You'll frequently find very common stories among bands about them being a collective of somewhat dysfunctional individuals, and this would certainly include myself. And the form of therapy is just letting out what's inside and getting it in front of yourself, and that's what moves you forward through life. I don't want it to sound negative when I talk about dysfunction or problems growing up that people have, but this collective, it's kind of a healing process, a collective healing process that's taking place.
Without knowing it, Glenn is describing the setup for Theodore Sturgeon's More Than Human, the classic sci-fi novel that the Dead read collectively when they were getting their chops together in 1966, about a group of supernaturally dysfunctional people who create a combined energy force greater than themselves, called a blesh. To outside observers, even if they didn't know the term, the Grateful Dead were obviously that. Another term that circulates around the Grateful Dead, sometimes attributed to Bob Weir, is misfit power. And Glenn Phillips and the Hampton Grease Band practiced that too.
It's like you think you're sort of picking up little pieces of little crumbs, but they're a trail and they lead someplace. Obviously, the Hampton Grease Band, I'd have to say, was inspired by the Grateful Dead, and influenced by it, but it doesn't sound like the Grateful Dead. The reason the Grateful Dead are great is because they sound like themselves. And it's the same other bands who find the truth inside themselves and find a way to get it out in front of them. That's what's important about music.
Sadly, owing to Owsley Stanley's bust in February, there are no tapes of the Sports Arena gig in May 1970, where the Hampton Grease Band opened, and the Dead borrowed the Allman Brothers amps and jammed with Brother Dwayne. But after their first two trips to Atlanta, vibes got a little harsher when they returned in November 1971.
Hey, that's not really necessary, man. That's not really necessary.
Okay, a lot harsher.
Okay, there ain't gonna be no music as long as there's cops on this stage.
For the next few years, the Dead were confined to the cavernous Omni.
I'd like to wish Dickie Betts a happy birthday. Today's his birthday.
It was only when the Jerry Garcia Band started touring in 1976 that they landed on the Fox. Originally opened in 1929, it was a contemporary of the St. Louis Fox Theater, another favorite Dead zone opened by William Henry Fox that same year, though they were hardly clones of one another. The Atlanta Fox was part of a Shriner temple, though the Shriners were gone by 1930. We've posted a link to a documentary about the venue's history at dead.net/deadcast.
I came here for the Metropolitan Opera when we would have a red carpet placed across Peachtree Street between the Georgian Terrace Hotel and the Fox Theater. And in between the acts, we would go across the street and have champagne and then come back by. And it was just a very glamorous time in Atlanta.
In the spring of 1978, There was still world-changing underground music to be found in Georgia, but the scene had shifted somewhat. The Allman Brothers had broken up in 1976, though they'd reunite later in the summer of '78. In 1975, Glenn Phillips had self-financed and self-released his solo debut, Lost at Sea. This is Lenore.
After the Grease Band broke up, I put out a solo album that I recorded on my own, and Richard Branson flew over from England and signed me to Virgin, and we went over there and toured.
Glenn and his music turned out to be the perfect way to evoke the changing times. Virgin Records had started from the original Virgin Record store in London. Its early releases are all what we lovingly call progressive. That was the titanically selling Tubular Bells by Mike Oldfield. There was a pretty big vibe shift going on, as Glenn discovered when he got to England.
I went over there. I stayed with Mike Oldfield while I was there, who, Tubular Bells, and he was a big Virgin artist. And I was hanging around a lot at the Virgin offices. And the Sex Pistols, I would cross paths with them at the Virgin offices. And plus I remember parties at Richard Branson's houseboat, and I'd run into people from different bands that were connected with Virgin. And so the Sex Pistols were around then.
God save the Queen. She ain't no human being. There is no future in England's dreaming.
After EMI signed and dropped the Sex Pistols, Virgin Records scooped them up, and the Sex Pistols version of punk detonated across brains around the world. In rock history, there's a before and after the Sex Pistols, just like there is for Elvis or the Beatles or Nirvana. But while your history books might frame punk in opposition to lots of other music, we here at the Deadcast are here to celebrate the whole spectrum.
Magazines were very much wanting to jump on whatever they thought was new in the breaking story and cover it. So they sort of presented this as a that was then, this is now sort of moment. This is what's new. This is what matters. But within the world itself, and this is what the Grateful Dead very much were about, and their audience were very much about, that was not really reality. That was marketing. And for musicians, and as well for, I think, a lot of people in the audience, it was an evolving, growing thing, but that didn't mean that it discarded the past. For some people, it did, like, oh, that all sucks. But even if you go back and listen to music that was coming out at the beginning of the New Wave era, you think of a band like Television. If you go back and listen to that first Television album, it's very clear that they were very much influenced by the Grateful Dead.
Television's Marquee Moon was released in February 1977 and remains a regular jam in this household. While we're throwing down mile markers for the Friend of the Devil's box, though, April 1978 was also the month of Television's second album, Adventure.
came back to Atlanta, the new wave punk movement was exploding. I wasn't really part of that except for the do-it-yourself ethos, where just make your own record.
Not only was punk exploding in Atlanta, punk was exploding on Atlanta. The Sex Pistols virtually followed Glenn Phillips home.
Ironically, they did their first show in the U.S. here in Atlanta and ended up hanging out with one of my neighbors that lived around the corner from me while they were in town.
The Sex Pistols' tour of the United States was pretty short, opening at the Great Southeastern Music Hall in Atlanta on January 5th. In Grateful Dead terms, it coincided almost exactly with a mini tour of California where Jerry Garcia lost his voice, which we talked about in the first episode of this season. The Pistols' run ended 2 weeks later at Winterland on January 14th, while the Dead were in Bakersfield, what turned out to be the Sex Pistols' final show of their original run.
Ever get the feeling you've been cheated? Good night.
The next night, January 15th, back in Atlanta, was another turning of eras, where the Glenn Phillips Band headlined the Capri Theater, with an opening set by Bruce Hampton, then during his stint as a stand-up comedian.
When I came back from England the first time, there was a lot of buzz because I had put Lost at Sea out and just put it out myself and recorded it at home. And the fact that this label was picking it up overseas and the record become big there. The first thing I did was I did a show at this theater in Atlanta, but I had Harold and Bruce come down and to do some songs with the band. So there was still this connection between the past, the present, and the future, but that was the kickoff of Bruce's solo career.
Every day, let the sunshine come through to you. Feel the sunshine in every way. Feel the sunshine. Lies of May.
That spring, Bruce Hampton was recording his first album outside the Hampton Grease Band, One Ruined Life of a Bronze Tourist. He wasn't yet a colonel, though, but went under the name Mr. Hampton B. Coles, retired.
I was down at Cocoa Beach, where the sun always shines. I was eating on some pineapple and some coconut brine, when along up to me came a man and he said, "You got the same head as my daughter, who was dead for some time."
But the epicenter of radical Georgian music had shifted to nearby Athens, where in April of 1978, the same month the Dead played the Fox, a new young band released their debut 7-inch single, which John Lennon later credited with reviving his own interest in making music. Ladies, gentlemen, non-binary heads, the B-52s.
Party. His dear love fell in the deep. Someone reached in and grabbed it. It was a rock lobster. Rock lobster.
There was a thriving musical scene that had a foot in the past and a foot in the present and the future. Bands like the Pool Cues, the B-52s, Pylon, the Fans, the Brains. These were all bands that were perceived of as being new wave. A lot of them grew up coming to hear the Grease Band and telling me that had an impact on them and influenced them. I identified very much with the bands that were playing. The Swimming Pool Cues at the time were considered a new wave band. I was really close friends with Jeff, who I still play with today. Bob Elsey, their guitarist, I gave guitar lessons to. I felt connected with these people. I'd sit in with them. They'd sit in with us. We'd do shows together.
A bomb woke me up. The only thing alarming was the noise. 80-volt signals over the wire. Shortwaves crack. Boggles of fire. Must be late. After one, or maybe some other number. A flash report, loud and clear, penetrates my slumber.
That was the Swimming Pool Cues with The A-Bomb Woke Me Up. Despite how the story is sometimes told, there was, and is, a pretty blurry line between the hippie underground and the punk underground. And I like imagining that there were probably a few very cool weirdos who caught some of the B-52's earliest gigs in Athens, and who also saw the Dead at the Fox in those years. The Grateful Dead could still be considered underground music in their own way in 1978, but they were their own kind of long-developing independent entity. They'd moved onto a parallel track around the time they started their own record company in 1973, and stayed there when they reintegrated with the mainstream a few years later. One aspect of Bill Graham's maxim about the Dead being the only ones who did what they did is that it didn't apply only to the musicians on stage, but their whole traveling crew. Nothing came fabricated. There was no one they could hire to come make recordings of their shows. We have the great recordist Betty Cantor Jackson to thank for taking that task on herself. We wouldn't be here talking about these shows today if not for her tapes. David Lemieux.
These are reels. These are all 7-inch reels running at 7.5 inches per second. So pretty much the standard 76 through 79.
And they sound amazing.
I just jumped the watch right outside the fence. Took his rings for bucks and change. Ain't that heaven sent?
If we'd had the tapes 25 years ago or when Dick was working on the tapes, I'm sure some of it, if not more than some of it, would have come out. The reason is these tapes weren't in the vault.
Hurts my ears to listen, then it burns my eyes to see. Cut down a man in cold blood, Shannon, might as well been me.
Betty Cantor had started making live recordings of the Grateful Dead in the early 1970s. Along with her then partner Bob Matthews, she oversaw the recording and engineering of the band's first 3 live albums, 1969's Live Dead, 1971's Grateful Dead, and 1972's Europe 72, as well as the scrapped live album from the Capitol Theater from February 1971, which we discussed back in Season 3 of the Deadcast. Along with Owsley Stanley and crew members Kid Candelario and Rex Jackson, who became Betty's husband, she also took responsibility for engineering work tapes for the band. Here's how Jerry Garcia described it to Ray White on WLIR in January 1979.
More often I listen to tapes of our most recent concerts because it's like homework. Yeah, we usually pull tape like out of the sound booth, and sometimes we have people who are recording like really nicely mixed 2-track Nagra tapes of the shows. As a matter of routine.
From the band's return to the road in 1976 through 1980, Betty Cantor Jackson recorded more shows than she erased.
Ship of fools on a cruel sea. Ship of fools sail away from me.
Now known as the Betty Boards, they're not pure recordings off the PA at the band's concerts, but special submixes, putting everything in balance. In the mid-1980s, after languishing in a storage locker, the tapes were auctioned for delinquent fees. We've linked to the story of the Betty Boards at dead.net/deadcast.
I think it was like 87 into early 88, at least in my tape trading world. That's when the Betty Boards started showing up. And the shows that came to my mailbox, padded envelopes with my Maxells, Beacon Theater in 76, the May shows in 77. And then the next kind of batch that came in of the Betty Boards for me was some of the April shows, and quite a few of the ones that are in this box. Anything that was a Betty board back in our tape trading days, it by definition was just not in the vault. They were the tapes outside that people got their hands on and made copies of that all of us tape traders benefited from. After Dick passed and I started listening to a lot more tapes for possible release, Dick's picks, road trips, now Dave's picks, other box sets, I kind of stopped listening to the shows that we didn't have a chance to release because I was so busy listening for work. But then Cornell came back to the vault. It came out. I'm extremely happy it did. And with those tapes around 2000, 2018, 2017, 2018, along with Cornell and Beacon Theater and all those great shows, came these first shows on the spring tour of the April run of the spring tour. I got to define it as the April and the May. That first April 6th to the 16th came back in their entirety, complete shows. We'd always had the 18th in Pittsburgh through the 24th in Illinois. We did get a little antsy a couple of years ago. And April 15th has already come out as part of the Dave's Picks. There were 25,000 of those. So hopefully everybody who gets this box has that Dave's Picks and can kind of complete the run of shows.
The April 15th, 1978 show in Williamsburg, Virginia became Dave's Picks 37. But we'll be including it in our storytelling during this series for sure. Today's episode covers the two shows from Atlanta, but if you saw the Dead that month in the Virginias or North Carolina, seriously, please hit pause and go record your memories at stories.dead.net. Glenn Phillips.
I think it was the second night that I went. I just went one of the two nights, and I really enjoyed it.
Though Glenn only caught the April 11th show, we're going to frame some of his comments around the April 10th gig, too, because they're pretty universal and strike a keynote for what was powerful about the Dead and their world in 1978.
When I went to that Dead show, this was 1978, 10 years from when the Grease Band first formed, and the world culturally had changed a great deal. And when I went to that show, I was really struck by the culture that had evolved around the Dead. It was like stepping it's like a science fiction movie where you're an explorer and you step into the jungle and you discover all these beasts from the past, but they're living and breathing and alive. And, it's like King Kong beating his chest and letting out a glorious yell. And that was the Grateful Dead.
If I had my way, if I had my way, if I had my way, I would tear this old building down.
And the fact that this scene had managed to stay alive and current and thriving, and the band had it well, was a real, at that point in time, was a inspirational and sort of jaw-dropping moment that this was still going on and this culture was still there in the midst of a world that the rest of the world felt like, oh, it's time to move on. This isn't valid anymore. And it was still valid and still alive, and obviously remain that way to this day. There were aspects of that still came to our shows, which I was very appreciative of and still felt connected to, but obviously nothing like on the level of the Grateful Dead. They were breathing life into this culture day in and day out. And other bands from that era, growing up, all the music that came from the West Coast, and especially the Grateful Dead, had a big influence on me and the people, other musicians that I was around. But culturally, they still did. You didn't see that impact on a day-to-day level. But when the Dead came in town, all those people came out, and you realized how alive that culture still really was.
One part of the Dead scene that was alive and thriving were the tapers. When we left Dr. Bob Wagner at the end of our last episode, he was dropping off his taping crew in Atlanta while he went back to Chapel Hill for class. We're delighted to welcome today one of Dr. Bob's passengers and one of his taping mentors, Steve Maizner. Steve got into Dead taping in a pretty funny way.
I started listening to the Grateful Dead basically on the radio, and then probably bought Working Man's Dead at my local record store. And they also had all these bootleg records. And it was like, okay, after hearing a few shows on WNEW, I said, well, I want more than just the album. And I bought a few of the bootlegs.
In the early 1970s, when reel-to-reels were expensive and cassettes hadn't fully caught on, bootleg LPs were one of the prime ways to consume live Grateful Dead music outside of going to see them.
We're up in Boston in 73 seeing the Dead. The first night they played the music hall 3 nights, and we didn't get in. We couldn't get tickets the first night. Yeah, we kind of went to their hotel room, and me and my buddy, we knocked on Garcia's door. It was really late by the time they came back, and he wasn't into partying, but he was very nice about it. And so you could just ask for Garcia's room. So the next morning we went there and hung out with him. He rolled up a couple of joints for us. And I couldn't believe, I'm used to a Colombian with seeds and stems or whatever. And he just rolls them so fast, and they were great and delicious. And I guess it was the first time in my life I ever smoked Sensimilla. He was just very nice. Other people came into the room, other fans, and we just talked about, his favorite guitar players, Dead songs. He was very modest as far as, he didn't think he was a good singer. We talked about different songs and how they touched us. And we started talking. And we were just talking about his music and songs. Have they changed? Let's say Cold Rain and Snow.
Well, I married me a wife. She's been trouble all my life. Run me out in the cold rain and snow. Rain and snow. Run me out in the cold rain and snow.
When it was recorded on the album, it was very fast, and now they had slowed it down.
She's been trouble all my life. Run me out in the cold rain and snow.
And I wouldn't have known that unless for these bootlegs. And he just went off going, wait a second, these guys are stealing the music from us. You should go in there and steal the albums because you can't get arrested for stolen material. I thought it was quite clever. But anyway, he basically says, if you want the music, go record it. And I'm like, what? You're going to let me record your shows? So it was really Garcia gave me some tacit permission to record.
Steve started taping soon thereafter, and by the mid-1970s was a regular at Dead shows.
We went to the Rochester shows in 76 and next night in Syracuse, and I got there a little late, and I set up right next to him at the soundboard, and I go, I'm going to find out if he minds or not. And it was a great first set, and next thing you know, he's like coming down and like, how'd it come out? How'd it come out? I go, what are you talking about? He goes, your tape. How'd it come out? I go, I don't know. Somebody spilled beer in the speaker yesterday in Rochester. It shot. And he goes, give me the tape. And he's listening to the tape and very excited. And he goes, yeah, yesterday you were wearing an orange shirt. You were too close. I go, you're telling me you saw me in the audience yesterday and I was too close? He goes, yeah, you got to be back a little bit farther for sound quality.
Though the Grateful Dead didn't officially allow taping until 1984, it was hard to get more direct than Garcia's permission to record and engineer Dan Healy's tips on how to do it righteously.
I was pretty blown away by that. My faith in this whole idea of a family, of this Grateful Dead family, which started actually probably in my first show, existed, that they care about the audience, that they're aware of the audience.
In 1976 and 1977, if the Dead were playing on the East Coast, and maybe the West, Steve was there. He made it to the Atlanta 77 shows at the Fox. The second night is now Dick's Picks 29.
Just one thing I ask of you. Just one thing
I had gone there the year before, and that was spectacular, and what a beautiful theater that is, and what a great show.
With that, let's turn our ears towards April 10th, 1978.
It was a paradise for lizards. One young Jacob saw it first. Said, I've seen some nasty desert love, but here's the worst.
That's a little bit of the Dead sound-checking Bob Weir's Salt Lake City in Atlanta from his then-new solo album Heaven Help the Fool. Ask your local tape collector for the rest.
They rarely recorded the Soundchecks, which is too bad because I always wonder. I mean, they soundcheck most shows, especially when it was a one-night run or the opening night of, in this case, a two-night run. Sometimes they make it through a whole song. Like the Salt Lake City in the soundcheck it's a bona fide full version of the song.
Where it's so easy keeping straight. Salt Lake City, which really makes Des Moines look second rate. They're making no big deal about it, but I hear them all the girls are really great.
Salt Lake City wouldn't make its Dead debut until 1995, when the Dead returned to the Salt Palace for the first time in a decade and a half.
They didn't rehearse the way they used to. You know, they didn't live together like they did in 66 and rehearse, 8 hours a day. It wasn't quite like that in the later days. So soundcheck is about as much rehearsal as you get, unless they were introducing new songs. Then they would have rehearsal sessions generally at Club Front.
Glenn Phillips.
When I saw that show, I enjoyed it and it was great, but it was very different. It was a very different chemistry. For some people, that's their favorite era of the band. For me, because of emotional reasons, I'm sure, and when I encountered stuff, it's the year 69. But hearing them, and I was, don't get me wrong, I was glad that they were staying together. And if you stay together that long, it's going to evolve and people are going to come and go. But it was a very different band with Keith and Donna than it was in 69.
This is Jerry Garcia speaking with WHMR in November 1978.
What we do is very close to it in spirit, in the sense that that the material is, for example, a song by our definition is really lyrics, melody, line, and changes. Apart from that, arrangement considerations are things that we don't rehearse or put together or, evolve in quite that way.
It is really interesting to see the impact that just one person adding to the band, or two people in the case of Keith and Donna, how much that influences the chemistry. The Grateful Dead were a big enough band and a big enough ongoing thing where they could keep it going and keep going through these evolving things and keeping the core of these members. And now it's at the point where, you have this Dead and Company at the Sphere, and it's like two guys from the band. And obviously the chemistry is wildly different.
This is another part of Bill Graham's equation about the Dead being the only ones to do what they do. Not only did the Dead have a wide repertoire, they had a wide repertoire that they didn't necessarily rehearse. Which might sound obvious, but it means they very rarely brushed up on the early intentions of the arrangements, and instead, let the songs develop without fixed parts. Here's how Brown-Eyed Women sounds in Atlanta, a song that Mickey Hart didn't play until he returned to the road in 1976. A case of the one definitely being where it thinks it is, or where it isn't. This is Bobby Weir speaking with David Gans in 1977. An interview that's now in Conversations with the Dead, a cornerstone in any Dead library. We've posted a link at dead.net/deadcast.
We've had to do a lot of conscious work on dynamics simply because, once again, with the reintroduction of Mickey, he missed out on like 4 or 5 years of just tacit understandings and agreements with regards to dynamics that we came upon. And so we finally had to start talking about it again when Mickey came came back, because otherwise he'd go banging and crashing through the quiet parts, or he wouldn't know when that sudden sucker punch is coming or whatever. And so we had to tell him, which means we had to be thinking about it, which means while we're thinking about it, we might as well be thinking about it.
The tides of the drummers were fascinating. As we discussed last time, they tightened up at the behest of producer Keith Olsen for Shakedown Street, and then kept right on changing. Sometimes it really worked. Instead of returning to their 60s dynamic, they found a new one. It helped that it fit very closely with Bob Weir's new rock and roll moves.
Weir was rocking out on this tour. He's always been a rock star, but Heaven Help the Fool, he was on his way to Bobby and the Midnights and his theatrics and stuff, and just amazing stuff. So you get Bob doing a lot of really good rock and roll at this show. It's all over now.
Well, baby, you stay all night long. Made me cry, looked you down your bottom. Hurt my eyes open, baby, that's no lie. Tables turn, now it's her turn to cry. 'Cause I used to love her, but it's all over now.
I remember putting it on, and it was probably only the second or third Dead version of this song I'd heard, but it's all over now, the Stones tune. There's a really good version of that on here.
Over the course of late 1977 and into 1978, the late John Sievert conducted an amazing multi-part interview with Jerry Garcia for Guitar Player magazine. We heard some of it last time, and we're going to hear more today and in future episodes. Immense thanks once again to the Retro Photo Archive for access to this material. None of the interviews were conducted in April precisely, but they reflect on Garcia's musical philosophies in that era. I'm pretty sure I'm not alone in hearing a continuity in Jerry Garcia's guitar playing and his singing.
What would your mama think if she heard my Guinness clink? Saw me riding at the end of my soldier's load.
Garcia told John Sievert pretty much the same thing.
My voice and my guitar are almost interchangeable. When I'm in my best space, when I really know the song, I can sing it really well, and I know the chords perfectly, or I can, I know where I am at all times, on the guitar. And I'm totally comfortable with those two things. There's a certain thing that happens which I like a lot. There's the thing of feeling very continuous between the person who is a guitar player and the person who is a singer. It's just a neat feeling. I can't describe it any other way. It's a feeling, really. And like I say, when I'm on, when the band's on, when everything is on, that thing starts to become almost magical. And I really like it. The way I start is by learning the literal melody of a tune, if there is one. Learning the literal melody, and then I construct solos as though that were happening, and I'm either playing with it or against it. And this is a very loose description because everything else works in there too,
Right.
Then later I start to see other kinds of connections. But one of my first processes in learning a new tune is to learn the literal melody, how to play the literal melody, in any position. don't have a real great melody tying the changes together in some sense, then the changes themselves don't mean anything to me. So that my ear draws me to melodies. So that's usually the thing I learn, and I just, I start from there classically, playing the melody as though I were singing it, and then start to build off of that.
I think it's safe to say that Peggy-O has the kind of melody Garcia is referring to. Or for that matter, Candyman. I love this version, where Garcia finds some really cool phrasings for his vocals.
Come on, you pretty women, with your hair hanging down. Open up your window, 'cause the candy man's in town.
I've never really tracked how often Garcia put in the extra S in women's. Maybe there should be a tag for that on Jerry Bass. There are lots of different classes of arrangement changes in the Dead songbook. Candyman possesses at least one of those. Here's how it sounded at Winterland in early 1974, now on Dave's Picks 13. And then we'll flip to the 78 version. Here's Garcia speaking on WHMR in 1978.
Phil isn't singing anymore. So all the songs that we used to do that he sang an important part on, we've had to drop until we were able to work out the parts with Donna. So some songs we haven't done simply because we haven't worked them out yet, and other ones like Uncle John's Band and St. Stephen are ones that we had to rework. So Donna would learn the top parts on.
And Bobby Weir speaking with David Gans in 1977 from Conversations with the Dead.
Yeah, he blew his voice. Improper singing technique, essentially. There but for fortune. He just wasn't singing properly, and he abused his throat, and you can only do that so long before you just have no range left. He could get it back with an operation, but it's an expensive operation. And then after that, you can't talk, you can't whisper or anything for 6 weeks. And then you come back very slowly. You can get your range back. Boy, I just don't want to lose my voice. Singing's the most fun I know. Playing is a great get-off. But the only one thing that I know that tops it is singing.
We can share the women, we can share the wine. We can share what we got of yours, 'cause we don't share all of mine.
Here they open the second set with Jackstraw, a traditional first set opening song. So again, it's the Dead now falling into this rhythm of the format that would be around for 17 years, but they're still constantly messing with it every night.
Jackstraw from Wichita, cut his body down. Took for him a shallow grave and laid his body down. Half a mile from Tucson by the morning light. One man gone and another to go. My old buddy, you're moving much too slow.
The score of the second set is built around the first of the Dead's two singles from 1977.
Dancing, dancing, dancing in the streets. Dancing, dancing, dancing in the streets. Dancing, dancing, dancing in the streets. Dancing, dancing, dancing in the streets.
The Dead debuted their original arrangement of Dancing in the Street, the 1964 Motown Civil Rights Anthem, in mid-1966. This one's from the Fillmore Auditorium on July 3, 1966, now on the 30 Trips Around the Sun box. They played it like this through the end of 1971. A copy editing note. When it was released by Martha and the Vandellas in 1964, the song was titled Dancing in the Street, singular, no apostrophe on dancing. When the Dead revived it in their so-called disco arrangement in 1976 and put it on Terrapin Station, it became Dancin' in the Streets, pluralized with an apostrophe. The late 70s arrangement was largely built on this guitar sound.
New York City, all we need is music, sweet music. There'll be music everywhere. There'll be laughing and singing, music swinging, and dancing in the streets.
And that guitar sound is Jerry Garcia running his Mutron auto-wah. We're going to dip into John Sievert's amazing interview to hear Garcia talk a little bit about his effects rig in 1978, which can be heard largely during the second set jam sequences.
I use effects with the Grateful Dead. I haven't started using them very much in my band, but I do have a whole rig, an effects rig that I use with the Grateful Dead that has some standard stuff. It has the Mutron envelope generator.
The Mutron 3 is a combination envelope filter and automatic wah-wah pedal. Dancing in the Street is one distinct example in this era. Also, Bob Weir's Estimated Profit debuted in 1977. This is from April 8th in Jacksonville. And actually, Garcia doesn't take his opening auto-wah solo on Fire on the Mountain on April 11th, so this is from April 8th too.
A Distortion Plus thing, from MXR.
The MXR Distortion Plus gets deployed along with the auto-wah on the solo to Estimated Profit. During the newly delineated space segments, like this one from April 11th at the Fox, you can hear a lot of the pedals on display.
The Mutron octave divider. The MXR phaser. Mutron wah-wah pedal and volume pedal, which I don't use the volume pedal very much, and a analog delay, MXR analog delay.
One reason Garcia didn't use the volume pedal much is because of one of the new additions to his Wolf guitar when Doug Irwin returned it to him in late 1977. If you look at pictures of the guitar in this era, or any of Garcia's guitars thereafter, you might notice two guitar cables coming out of it.
I have one innovation in wiring, and that is this second hole. Now, what happened? The way this works, because of the wiring of the whole Fender idea, everything comes before the final volume pot. Now, what I've done is created an interrupt stereo in-out hole. Well, when it's not in, it's just normal.
I see. So
but if I plug it in, then I have a chord where it's a stereo, it's a send down one side of the chord, and it's a return of the other back into the guitar before the volume pot. Now, what I do, the reason for that is, when you come in after the switch, the pickup selector switch and the tone pots, what's coming through is the pickup's wide open. Now, when you use outboard devices, fuzz tones, and any of those gadgets whose function, the way they work, their behavior is dictated by input voltage. What this does is make it so they always see the same input voltage. They always see full out pickup input voltage. And they return back into the guitar before the volume pot to the amplifier, see? So that I can set my sounds up, like an envelope generator, like the Mutron, envelope thing, which is very voltage sensitive. Set it up so it behaves exactly the way I want, and then I have the option of playing at any volume based on output.
That's a pretty heady concept, and one that took me a little to get my head around. But to linger on it just slightly, somebody once sent us a very nice message asking if we had any interviews with Ramrod, the Dead's trusted and long-serving roadie. In the course of talking, John Sievert caught some of the elusive Ramrod, known to some as Lawrence Shirtliff of Pendleton, Oregon.
Say it. Lawrence Leo Shirtliff. And erase that, please.
Ramrod.
You don't want to talk into the microphone?
No, I'm not opposed to talking into the microphone.
But Ramrod relented. Here's Garcia and Ramrod talking through Garcia's signal chain. Ramrod is the voice slightly closer to the microphone.
The octave and then the envelope filter. Octave divider is first in line.
Right.
The envelope filter, the Mutron.
It's a Mutron, okay.
Is the next.
Then it goes to the distortion.
Distortion device.
Then it goes to a phasing device. To a wah-wah pedal.
To the analog delay.
To an analog delay.
Back to the network box.
Back to this box. Then to his instrument.
Up the stereo cord.
Up the other side of the stereo cord.
So your control over dynamics is a function of volume control. In other words, they are stable. No matter how I set them, they won't vary.
Yeah, and if he flips a switch, there's no jump in gain or loss in gain.
Right.
With the amplifier. Yeah.
Real simple, anybody can do it.
Yeah, and if troubleshooting it wise,
really
if all this shit gets crazy, you kick it out, it's still the same gain, there's not a big jump or a loss.
It was a long-term problem they'd spent some time thinking about.
Some devices, when you turn them off, the device isn't active, but the combine of its network represents a load on the circuit. We've endeavored to straighten that across, and we've been pretty successful at it.
Though Ramrod didn't design any of the circuitry, he had a functional knowledge of how much of the Dead's gear worked.
I will say that I am responsible for the guitars in the Grateful Dead and the things that they have to deal with from picks to speakers.
If a guitar needed to go someplace for repair, Ramrod was its first stop. And if Ramrod couldn't fix it, he'd find the person who could.
The repair guys are guys that I've known for years and years and years, and they're Rick Turner, Ron Wickersham, Quan has worked on a lot of our things. Doug Irwin, essentially, is who has Jerry's instruments, electronically as well as physically. Electronically on Phil's instruments, there's Ron Wickersham and Rick Monday, who have designed the electronics and the networks within Phil's basses, which I haven't and I can't fix, so I cannot say that I am responsible for Phil's basses. But I am responsible to Phil for his instruments, and I know George Monday, and Rick Turner, and Ron Wickersham, real personally. I can be a buffer amp so far as that goes, right? That seems to be my strongest quality.
Ramrod's role as a buffer extended past the instruments and into nearly all elements of the Dead's creative lives, an indispensable part of the operation. When Garcia talks about keeping his equipment stable, I have to think he's talking about Ramrod too.
The more elements that I can keep stable, the more you can concentrate on your playing and not be continually adapting your technique to your equipment.
Though the Dead's gear changed constantly with the rise and fall of the wall of sound, there were actually some unchanging elements.
The first amplifier that I used with the Warlocks was a twin reverb. I bought a twin reverb, the first year they came out. I guess it was 64, 63, somewhere around there. My original one may still be being used by Mike Wilhelm from the Charlatans. He bought it from me, and it's a great amplifier. It really is good. But I am using the second one, the old blackface one. And now it's only a chassis. I only use the preamp, just the chassis and the front of it and stuff like that. But it's basically the same old Fender preamp, Fender twin reverb, an old blackface, going through a Macintosh 2300. That drives 4 JBL 12-inch speakers. It's real simple.
That about covers Garcia's tone in '78, but certainly not all of his playing, which we'll return to shortly. First, more of the dancing in the street jam. By this point, Garcia has turned off the auto wah and is playing with a pretty clean tone. The dancing in the street unfolded into the evening's Rhythm Devils segment. Once again, it opened up into steel drums, where Jerry Garcia and other non-drumming members of the Dead were very likely playing percussion. There's no space segment on the first night in Atlanta. David Lemieux.
The Rhythm Devils portion, we're still up in that 15-minute range. They come out of drums with Franklin's Tower. It was, this is the Dead at their adventurous best. They'd already dropped about 6 months earlier. They dropped Help on the Way and Slipknot. So Franklin's Tower was a bit of a free agent at this time. It could appear anywhere in the set list. It would sometimes be joined with Half Step to open a show. It would just appear in strange places. And I love that about this.
Send out a shout here to my buddy, the other Bill the drummer, born on this particular April 10th. For the Dead, it was one more Monday night in Atlanta. But then there was Tuesday. Steve Maizner hadn't actually taped the first night at the Fox, just enjoyed himself.
Some of these shows I record and some I don't. I just, it's too much to do it every night for me, and maybe I like to get too loose or something like that. But anyway, I did tape the Florida shows, but I did not tape the first night in the Fox Theater, but the second one I did.
He had some help from an unexpected source, front of house engineer Dan Healy.
My ticket was right in front of the soundboard, and I think I had a problem. Maybe I didn't have many batteries, and Healy and I had struck up a casual friendship, and I had asked him, "Hey, can I borrow some power from you? Can I plug in somewhere?" And that led to, what are you recording on? I go, well, I got a Knock 550, and I got 3 mics, And he goes, oh, man, listen, you got to set up the mics like this. And he was working on, I don't know exactly what he would call it, but I'll say something like a surround sonic experience where sound was coming from all over the hall.
In 1974, the Dead had toured the world and elsewhere with what's now known as the Wall of Sound, but opted for smaller systems when they returned to the road a few years later. In the spring of 1978, they were rocking a system from the East Coast PA crew, the Clare Brothers. But the Wall was still present. For some of this period, and I'm not totally sure if Spring 78 is included, the setup included a monitor setup built by Harry Popick that incorporated 12-inch and 5-inch speakers from the Wall, cut down into monitor wedges. The whole system was tweaked by Wiz Leonard and Dan Healy, who also occasionally offered taper advice to people like Steve Maizner.
And he goes, look, your ears don't go forward where we're watching. They go off to the side. They're like omnidirectional microphones, and everybody, and you're using directional mics at the PA because it sounds good, but it's not picking up what our ears actually hear. And so he convinced me and helped me set up to take two mics and put them to the left and the right, and the third mic centered.
Unfortunately, Steve hasn't yet digitized his 3-mic recording of the Fox, so our Betty boards will have to do. David Lemieux.
When I got these two shows, I liked them both, but I like this one better.
We'll use the Bertha opener to mention another subtle musical change, one that I didn't notice until recently, after decades of listening to the Dead, and didn't even notice in time for the previous season of the Deadcast. Here's how Bertha sounded at the beginning of 1974. Pay attention to the groove and the way Bill Kreutzmann is playing it. Now here's what the groove sounded like a little bit later in the year, at Hartford at the end of July, now on Dave's Picks 2.
I had a hard run, running from your window.
Between the Pacific Northwest tour in May and the shows in June 1974, drummer Billy Kreutzmann altered the Bertha groove, falling back into the pocket so it feels more like halftime, kind of like they love each other. The groove stayed like this until after the band's year off from touring and into 1977. But somewhere in mid-1977, it became a little more variable, depending on how the drummers felt it that night. Here it is again from the second night at the Fox in 78, where they play it with the funkier 74 feel. And here's how they played it the very next night in North Carolina, leaning into the more straightforward pulse. One of the many subtle things to listen for in Grateful Dead shows that I know my ear will now be attuned to. I like the happening and playful space Garcia and Weir find inside the Tennessee Jed bounce. The real highlight comes in the second set, with the 23-minute Scarlet Begonias Into Fire on the Mountain.
In the heat of the evening when the daylight got rough, too bad to open and too cool to blow. As I picked up my matches and was closing the door, had one of those flashes. I'd been there before.
It's a sweet reading of the song, sounding alive and in motion from the very first beat. In accordance with them being in a small theater, Donna Jean does some improvising too. Not always a given in the post-hiatus years. Let's use this sparkling, bubbling example of a Scarlet Begonias jam as a soundtrack to Jerry Garcia's thoughts about the Dead's group improvisation from his extended 1978 interview with John Sievert.
Every role is being redefined in the Grateful Dead. Like Phil doesn't play conventionally. The drummer, nobody plays conventionally. So everybody has to solve that problem of how to fit into unconventional contexts. And so it feeds back into itself. So everybody is unconventional. So in that context, and I appreciate how difficult it is. That's one of the things that's interesting about the Grateful Dead. That my logic is not anybody else's logic. Everybody has their own logic. So the way Weir develops, for example, always surprises me because the way he develops is unlike the way I develop. And same with Phil and everybody else in the band. Everybody develops a different way and with a different sense to their development. And the interesting thing about that is that all of a sudden there's somebody who's got a whole bunch of ideas that you haven't stumbled on and might never. The Grateful Dead we've never developed as a group. I mean, we develop as a group in a certain kind of large sense, but everybody's individual development has that thing of being surprising, interesting, entertaining, if you will, any of those things. So that's one of the things that keeps the Grateful Dead an interesting thing to be involved in.
You can hear Garcia engage the auto-wah here. There was a good deal to say about his partner in guitaring, Bobby Weir.
He's really a fine player, and he doesn't get the credit he deserves. I really think he's the finest rhythm guitar player on wheels right now. Weir has really created a definition for his own playing and an approach to his playing that is really amazing. It's an amazing achievement. Playing with Weir is he's like my left hand or something. He and I have a long and serious conversation going on musically. The whole thing is that the complementary nature, incredible energy, is always fascinating to me. We have fun. That's the thing, and we've designed our playing to work against each other. His playing, in a way, really puts my playing in the only kind of meaningful context it could enjoy. That's a hard idea to communicate, but in the Grateful Dead, any serious analysis of the music that we're playing, the way we're approaching it, you would see that things are designed really appropriately. There are some passages and some kinds of ideas that, geez, I mean, if I had to solve the problem, how do I create a harmonic bridge between these things that are happening rhythmically with two drums? There's amazing power on the rhythmic level. Phil's innovative bass style. It's unlike anyone else. Weir's ability to solve that particular kind of problem is really extraordinary. knows how to do that thing of color. He's a guy who has a really beautiful grasp of altering chords. His way of coloring things so that something that's like with a minor seventh feel, that he can sneak in other flavors, that really influence what I can do then, And all of a sudden there's this augmented voice. Weir has got extraordinary large hands, so he's able to voice chords to do some of those close voicings, that you can't. I mean, you have to have really big
long
hands
reach.
Yeah. And he can pull those things off. They're just part of the flow of his playing. He does stuff that's mind-boggling and really.
For example, when I'm singing, it's common for Bob to be signaling dynamic changes or accents. He's gotten real good at calling accents. He can get the whole band to accent like on the 2 or the end of 3, just with a signal. And it ends up sounding amazing. Of course, for years it sounds awful, 3 people would catch it, 4 wouldn't.
And that's just the start of the second set. David Lemieux.
You get a very late version of Sunrise. Sunrise, Donna Jean, by this point, had started moving towards From the Heart of Me, the song that would appear on Shakedown Street. So, similar to Brent having his 2 early songs, Far From Me, Easy to Love You, she had her 2 songs in 77 and 78. So Sunrise, beautiful version.
Gazing at the burning by the water. Before he speaks, the world around us quiets.
Written about the band's friend Rolling Thunder, Sunrise was Donna Jean's first original song for the Grateful Dead, and one we'll get into down the line.
I remember Dick Latvala told me he went to the East Coast for a couple of the spring of 77 shows, and he went to the Hartford show and he was talking about Sunrise, and he said, and I don't think he hadn't heard it yet, it was a brand new song, and he said I saw Dawn and she was doing I thought it was opera. Dick, who's a deadhead who lived and breathed this music in 77 and anytime, he said it was like they're doing some kind of opera thing. And she's filling that 16,000 seat venue with her pipes.
We are singing and praying. I hear what he's saying.
Terrapin Station was the big set piece that led into Rhythm Devils. Barely a year old, there wasn't much jamming in it yet. At the very end of 1978, starting at the Capitol Center in November, they would develop what I call the Starlight Jam, between the final verse of the Lady with the Fan section and the Since the End is Never Told transition into Terrapin proper. It would become an ineffable and uneffable part of the song.
Storyteller makes no choice. Soon you will not hear his voice. His job is to shed light, not to master.
But on this box set, that was 7 months away. In the spring of 78, they were still sticking to the libretto mostly, though you can hear Garcia and Keith Godchaux playing with a few brief new harmonies in the outro. Like many nights of the tour, There are scene reports of Garcia and others joining Billy Kreutzmann and Mickey Hart for the Rhythm Devils segment, playing steel drums and other percussion. One musical moment I like in this version is when the steel drums and the other chaos pair up with what I think is a balafone. While the drummers, and the other drummers, were drumming, Steve Maizner flashed on what engineer Dan Healy had told him about mixing for the room.
It seemed like everybody was involved. Roadies would come out with pots and pans, and it was just very, very exciting. And sure enough, I think probably during the Rhythm Devils, I heard sound coming behind me, and I told him that after the show, and he was so excited. Yeah.
Another bit of a surprise coming out of the 15-minute Rhythm Devils, little spacey jam before they kick into Iko. And Iko had been in the repertoire very sporadically for about a year. It joined in St. Louis in May 15th of 77. And it was a song that it became something different. It became a really upbeat party song when I was seeing the Dead in the later 80s, a shorter song, and it would be like really high energy. These ones are not high energy.
Iko had come into the Dead's repertoire during the fabled Spring 77 tour, though they were still feeling their way through its groove, and it was pretty similar to Not Fade Away in its earliest versions. Here's the debut from St. Louis, now on the May 1977 box.
Set your tail on fire. Hey now, hey now, hey now, hey now. Iko, honey. Giacomo Fino, honey. Giacomo Fino.
To me, the Fox 78 version is notable because it's the first one where they find a feel for it that has its own identity.
They're introspective, almost like a Not Fade Away without the intensity of Not Fade Away, those big explosive things that Not Fade would do. And I love the groove. I mean, it's almost meditative Grateful Dead music where they get into it and the drummers are clearly having fun. Donna sounds great. Jerry's loves it. I mean, they love this song. You can really tell how much fun they have playing it.
I love the way Garcia digs into the lyrics on this version.
Set your tail on fire. Hey now, hey now, hey now, hey now. Iko, honey. Giacomo Fino, honey. Giacomo Fino.
Garcia spoke a bit about Iko in a July 1981 interview with Greg Harrington.
The original rock and roll version of Iko, the Dixie Chaps.
You're talking about hey now, Aiko ande, Giacomo Fino anale, Giacomo Finane.
Aiko is all this, it's all this sort of codified Bayou talk, like Creole and all that stuff, yeah. And it's full of little stuff that you can't know about unless you know something about that whole world.
All in all, it was a pretty swell Tuesday in Atlanta. The Dead played a few smaller venues than the Fox in 1978, but not many, and a lot of them were field houses or other kinds of dumps. They'd return to the Uptown in Chicago a few times, and would make their last visit to their beloved Boston Music Hall in the fall. But the smaller rooms were increasingly the domain of the Jerry Garcia Band, the Bob Weir Band, and other side trips.
And I like having the range all the way from little clubs to huge arenas because there's different scales of energy at which you address the music. And larger rooms bring out a kind of grandness and a largeness in the music that you wouldn't get in a smaller room or that you wouldn't necessarily get in theaters and so forth.
The end result of Bill Graham's phrase about the Dead being the only ones who do what they do is another obvious thing that's not necessarily true about many of the Dead's contemporaries. There's nowhere else, or when, the music at these shows could have happened. Yes, to reiterate what Weir said, thank you.
Friends, thank you very much for tuning in to the Good Old Grateful Deadcast. We'd like to thank our guests in this episode, Donna Jean Godchaux-MacKay, Glenn Phillips, Steve Maizner, and David Lemieux. Extra special thanks to friend of the Deadcast, David Gans, for his ongoing contributions of audio from his interview archive. Thank you, David. We couldn't do it without you. Executive producer for the Good Old Grateful Deadcast, Mark Pincus. Produced for Rhino Entertainment by Rich Mahan Promotions and Jesse Jarno. Special thanks to David Lemieux, Brian Dodd, and Doran Tyson. All rights reserved.